Welcome to IT Pro TV. I'm your host, Don.
Coming at you live from San Francisco, California.
You're watching IT Pro TV.
Hello, and thank you for choosing IT Pro TV, helping you learn wherever you go. I'm your host, Zach Memis, as we continue on with CompTIA Net Plus Network Service Functions. This is part 3. And that's right. And in fact, we left off with DHCP. But before we get there, I have to introduce this fellow right here. This is Wes Bryan. He knows everything. Wes, thanks for being here.
Hey, it's good. You set that bar high. Hopefully you're going to stick around and help me hold that bar. But that's right. I know a little bit, right? And what we want to show you is enough, hopefully, and hopefully it's that you'll pass that Net Plus exam. Keep in mind that, we try to give a good comprehensive overview of some of the objectives that you're going to see. But you can always learn more, and you can always study. So let's go ahead, and we're going to look at DHCP inside of this episode.
And I was just going to ask you that. Maybe give us a recap, too, of where we've been and where we're going, but DHCP, certainly.
Yeah, in the first couple of parts, we'll start with a recap. Remember, in the first couple of parts, we talked about a very, very important service that's out there, and it really revolves around name resolution, right? Again, it is mapping names to IP addresses, if you will, so that we can find things like computers, we can find services, we can find, an email server for a domain. And it's kind of interesting. One of the things, Zach, that I didn't mention in there that I do have to, we talked about in other episodes, we mentioned the record types, right? And we went through all the various records, A records, Quad A records, MX records, PTR records, canonical names or C names, aliases, if you will. One of the ones that I didn't mention, and I want to go ahead and mention now, is an NS record, because we want to be complete to the objectives. And NS record is essentially nothing more than a name server record, right? If you don't want, if you want a DNS server to basically to know where a name server is for another domain, what you can do is you can put an NS record up in the DNS zone, and what that will do is when you are looking for a name that correlates with this name server's domain namespace, if you will, basically DNS can say, hey, well, let me return you the IP address of the name server, and then you can go just talk directly to that DNS server, and you can get your resolution there. So that was one of the records that I didn't mention when it comes to DNS. So if you're not aware of some of the records that we're talking about, or that doesn't make sense to you, please go back and watch the first 2 parts. That's right. So we're going to move on into our part 3, talking about the DHCP service. Now, in other episodes, we've talked about, how we obtain IP addresses. We've talked about things like static IP addressing, where I have to manually configure IP addresses on all of our computers, and that does run the risk for not only being an administrative complexity, the fact that you have to do this multiple times. If you have 1,000 computers in your network, if you're doing everything statically, you got to do this 1,000 times, right? You have to configure things like subnet masks, default gateways, the DNS servers, and that also leads to configuration errors. Remember that one of the things that we can do is we can set that DHCP server out on our network, and we can set our clients up to use DHCP, and they call out to the network when they need an IP address and say, hey, anybody out there got an IP address? I could really use one. And the DHCP service, if it's configured to respond, will respond with an offer and some additional configurations, right? We're going to look a little bit more at the DHCP server side of it itself. If you're not aware of what the DHCP, or the Dynamic Host Configuration Protocol, I hate doing that, especially to our CompTIA viewers out there. I've said an acronym 4 or 5 times and haven't once mentioned what that acronym is. Dynamic Host Configuration Protocol, right? We're going to look a little bit more at the service and some of the components inside of the service. So I tell you what, without further ado, let's just go ahead, and rather than just speak about everything that we have to talk about, let's go ahead and do both at the same time. We'll kind of show you and talk about some of the things that we're seeing. So I'm back on the same Windows server here that we had in the last episode. You might remember that we looked at tools, and we went to the roles, and if you remember, we pulled up the DNS console, all right? Well, I've got DHCP here too. Now, this role, I've installed it, but I haven't done any configurations on it, because the great thing about configuring it is the wizard that I really like that Microsoft has here kind of points you through some of the topics that we need to look at for the exam here. So what a great way, if you haven't seen, bringing a DHCP server online and configuring it for the first time to start handing out IP addresses, and then some of the components that make up the DHCP service that can also help to assist the computers that are on your network. So you'll see here if I go up to the little action event flag here, notice it does say we need a post-deployment configuration here for me, and what that means is that I need to complete the DHCP configuration. Now, I will tell you, when I click this link, there's one thing that I'm going to have to do here that is really kind of unique, if you will, to the Windows world. Understand that this is not on the exam, but I just don't want you guys to be confused here. What this is going to do is this is going to create the computers, the security groups inside of our Active Directory so that they can use and not only use but also configure DHCP and then authorize the DHCP server, because it says if domain joined, this DHCP server is domain joined, and authorizing that server just means it's allowed to hand out IP addresses on our network. Understand that's a Microsoft, that's a Windows domain thing, that's a Windows DHCP server. That's not something that's going to be on the exam objectives, but we have to do it to go ahead and start. So I'll go ahead, commit this, we'll bring this server online, basically creating the security groups and authorizing the DHCP server in Active Directory so that we can hand out IP addresses. Let me make sure that I close that. And now that that's done, we can launch our DHCP console. Now, DHCP console looks a lot like our DNS management console as well, right? It looks a lot
like it, yeah.
It doesn't look much different, right? And we can see that this just happens to be our DHCP server here. And if I expand this out, I'll see that we have two protocols, because remember, like we've talked about IP addresses in other episodes, the DHCP service, remember that not only can we hand out IPv4 addresses, we can also hand out IPv6 addresses, all right? So what we're gonna focus on right now is we'll just kind of drill down into IPv4. All right, now IPv4, to get this up and running, all right, so that we can start handing out IP addresses, we need to create what's known as a scope. All right, now scope, we're not talking about mouthwash here, right? But what we're talking about here when we say scope is a range of addresses that we want to hand out to clients when they call out to the network and they say, I need an IP address. Anybody got one? Well, for us to offer an IP address, we have to have a scope, right? That's where it starts, right? So let's go ahead, and what we'll do is we'll right-click on our IPv4 here, and we're going to choose, we're going to choose New Scope. All right, so that's the very first part. We'll choose New Scope, and this will bring us into our New Scope wizard, which is what we want. All right, I love these wizards because they're very easy. They kind of walk you through everything that you need to know, and you can name the scope. The name is arbitrary. It's for identification purposes on your side, right? So I might just say, I don't know, clients maybe. Maybe I just want to say this is the client scope. Again, this is up to you. It's all up to your how you do the architecture in your network. All right, now, the next thing that we need to do is we need to configure a range, all right? A range of IP addresses. So I'm going to give out this from this IP address to this IP address, all right? Now in doing that, what that's going to do is it's going to give us a certain amount of IP addresses that we have to lease out. So let's go ahead and let's say I'm going to do 192.168. We're doing private IP addresses here. And instead of doing 1.1, I'm not going to do 1.1. All right, why? Well, a lot of times, and it doesn't have to be, but your very first address within a network range, a lot of times it's not reserved, but admins like to reserve it for their default gateway. All right, so the router, right? So now everybody knows that 1.1, the very first network address within that network range, is going to be your router. So we're going to go ahead, and what we're not going to do is 1.1. We're actually going to start here from 192.168.1.2. And then from here, we'll say, well, what's the last address in this range that we want to give out, right? How many addresses are we going to have? What I'm going to do here, other than 1.1, I'm going to do the entire Class C network of 192.1.0. We'll do the entire network range. So what we're going to do here is we're going to do 192.168. 1.254, right? Remember, those of you that have looked at some of our other episodes, I can't give out 255. That's the broadcast address. All computers use that to receive broadcast communications. That's why it's not 255 and it's 254. That's the last usable IP address, essentially, within this network. All right. Now, the next thing that we do is we configure things like the subnet mask, right? And I can modify this. I can do this a couple different ways. I can do CIDR if we happen to be doing classless interdomain routing, right? And I can do a variable link subnet mask, VLSM. But I'm going to go ahead and I'll just leave it classful, right? So we're going to use a /24, 24-bit subnet mask, or a 255.255.255.0, right? And we'll choose next. All right. Now, we also have what are known as exclusions. I'm going to come back to exclusions here because I want to show you setting up exclusions, all right? But let's go ahead and give you what the definitions are, right? An exclusion says if you've got within this range that you just created, all right, if we go back to my computer, within this range right here, you've got a certain set of addresses that you don't want this DHCP server to hand out. Maybe you've got things like voice over IP phones, right? They're statically mapped. They're not changing. They don't rely on a dynamic address. You statically map those. Well, if I want, I could put a range. I could do, let's say, maybe 192.168.1. And I don't know. Maybe I've got a few addresses, right? 150, and I can do 192.168.1, and I could do maybe 200. And I say that. It's kind of hard for me to type, apparently. And then what I could do is I could add that, and that says those 50 addresses will not be handed out to anybody. I don't care. If you call out on the network and you say, hey, you got an IP address, you're not going to get these addresses, right? And then if we had 50 voice over IP phones that were statically mapped, guess what? They're excluded from that entire range, and they're not going to be handed out. Now, I'm not going to do that because I'd also want to show you that you can also do this after the fact. Keep in mind what I'm doing here doesn't mean that you have to keep it that way, or doesn't mean that you can't change it later or add later, right? We'll go ahead and we'll choose next. All right. Another one too. Let me go ahead and also tell you that another thing that might happen. All right. If you've got a statically mapped printer, all right, out there, a network printer, and it's not using DHCP in any fashion, well then guess what? You can also set maybe a network printer, or maybe you got a series of statically mapped IP addresses for the different network printers within your building, and you don't want those IP addresses handed out to other machines because it would cause some kind of IP conflict, right? Well, I can put that range in here. No different. The purpose is is the same with an exclusion. All right. Now we'll go ahead and we'll choose. We're not going to add that. We'll choose next. And the next thing is what's known as a lease duration. All right. Remember when we talked about obtaining a dynamic IP address in another episode? Let's just really quick recap that, all right? Remember, when you receive an IP address from a DHCP server, it's not yours to use indefinitely, all right? It's kind of like a rental car, all right? You're going to use it for a certain period of time. At a certain point within that period of time, you've got an option. You could try to communicate with the DHCP server, and you could say, hey, I'm still here. I'm still using that IP address. And depending on how the administrator has it configured, a lot of times they say, okay, well, we'll just renew the lease and we'll make it for this amount of time. Or if there is no response, hey, I'm here, I'm still using that IP address, and there's crickets out there and the DHCP server isn't responding for whatever reason. Or the admin decides doesn't want to renew the lease. Well, then when that hits the end of that lease period, the IP address is flushed. It's no longer usable. All right, that's up to you. Now, I will tell you, if we look here for things like wired networks, a lot of times what you'll do is you'll have an 8-day lease. By default, you have an 8-day lease. You might see things like mobile devices, like maybe you have devices that come onto a network, like a wireless network. It's a mobile device, picks up a Wi-Fi, IP address over the Wi-Fi network. Mobile devices, sometimes they're only on your network maybe an hour. So I might shorten that lease time maybe to 24 hours. It could be 2 hours. Just for mobile devices. Because what's going to happen? If it discards the IP address because the lease is expired and it's still set to use DHCP, it's no big deal. The DHCP server's still online. It's just going to say, okay, I need an IP address out there, or it'll communicate with it and it'll renew it. So by default here in Windows, it is, and I changed it from the default, it is 8 days, and we'll just go ahead and we'll leave that normal. All right, or the default, nothing normal. You can configure it any way you want. All right, now I'm also going to come back to the DHCP options here in a second because I want to show you how we can apply those to the scope. All right, again, I'm going to talk about it here, but then I'll also show you a little bit on how to configure them too. All right, now the scope. All right, the scope is going to be all those IP addresses that are in that address pool, right? That pool is the available addresses within that range, right? So if I have 200 addresses that I can hand out, right? In this case, I have 253 addresses that I could hand out within this scope, right? That's the pool, that range, right? Well, you can also, if you think about the name, I always like to break down the acronyms because the acronyms really help you understand what's going on sometimes behind this protocol. Dynamic means it can change, right? We got a lease duration. It can change. You can get another IP address. Host configuration. When I hand you an IP address, so the DHCP server hands a client, a DHCP client, the IP address, it configures its network adapter with that IP address. It's a host configuration protocol, but that's not the only thing. Remember, like we talked about, the difference between static and dynamic IP addressing. One of the great things about DHCP is I can tell you exactly what your subnet mask is, which is also defined by the scope when we just set that up. But I can tell you what your default gateway is. I can tell you, hey, you're going to use this router, right? And more. You're going to use this DNS server. We got an internal DNS server, and I want you to use that. But you know what? I'll go ahead and I'll configure a secondary DNS server for public addresses as well. So I can hand out options, additional host configurations, not just IP address and subnet mask, if I apply the options to the scope. All right. Now we're going to go ahead and say no, because I do want to show you inside of your DHCP console where you can do that, and we'll choose next. All right. Now, when we look at this, pay attention to your review summaries. All right. Because in a lot of configurations that you do, you can reverse. There are a few that are inside of like your Windows servers that you really, it'd be problematic to go back and try to change. So just use your reviews, all right? Review and make sure that there's not any important information that you have missed, all right? Now, I want you to notice that we have IPv4, and we got a little down arrow here. It's telling me here that I got an issue, all right? Now, what I've got here is I actually have to activate this scope so that it can start handing out IP addresses. I haven't activated it yet, and why doesn't it go active right away? I might have some additional configurations that I need to do to it before I start handing out IP addresses, like those options that we were talking about, all right? So I might want to do that. So let's go ahead and notice that I have under scope. Now be careful, because you can have multiple scopes, all right? You can have a DHCP server that is handing out a certain range or pool of addresses and also handing out another pool of addresses, all right? And each individual scope can have scope options. That means that it just applies to the scope. So when I configure options here, it only applies to the 192.168.1.0 scope. I could have one here if I have two networks here, right? 192.168.2.0 scope. And if I configure scope options here, it applies just to that scope. But there's also server options, all right? And server options say, I don't care what scopes you have. I want you to apply these options to every scope that this server is currently managing. You don't have to worry about those right now. Just want you to know that they're there so you can, if there are any questions, hey, what's the difference? Server level options apply to all scopes. Scope level options only affect the scope that they're applied to. That's important. All right. So let's go ahead and let's look. Well, what options do we have? Do we have options on the table? Well, we're going to go ahead and we're going to right click on our scope options, and you're going to see that we have, well, the option to configure options. Boy, that's redundant, right? And we'll go ahead and select that. And here are some of the general options that we have. Like I said, default gateway. By the way, they also have numbers. I would pay attention to these numbers. And there are a bunch of them. And I mean, when I scroll through here, Zach, you can see there are tons of them,
and
right?
we have to memorize all of those for the exam, right?
No, absolutely not. Because if you did, this exam would take a very long time to get under your belt. But I'm glad you asked nonetheless, though, joking aside. There are a couple that I would remember. And one is that 003. All right, that is your router. All right, that is essentially the IP address of your default gateway. All right. And we could do, and I could do something like 192.168.1.1, and I could add this. All right. So now it says when you get an IP address, let's say, I'm looking over here at Zach. Let's say Zach's computer comes online and says, I need an IP address, right? Well, Zach, you're going to get this IP address. We already defined the subnet mask inside of the scope when we created it. So you're already going to get this subnet mask. Good. You're also going to get the IP of the router that I want you to have. So you'll be able to talk and communicate off of your local network. So that's a great thing, right? Now, the next one that we have here that I want you to worry about, if we scroll down just a little bit more, I think it's there's a 006, right? That's our DNS servers, right? And you can see it gives you DNS servers, right? What DNS servers do you want to use? Now, I could use the name here. Like, for instance, I could do dco1.demo.itpro.tv, right? I could use the name, and I could say, you know what? Just go ahead, DNS, do me a favor. We talked about DNS, right? And I could say, just resolve that for me. I don't want to resolve it. I can't remember what the IP address is. Remember, I told you there are services that rely on DNS. Well, look here. I put in a name, and it resolved it to the IP address.
Yeah.
All right. So, like I said, applications rely on DNS for name resolution, right? Now, there are other ones, too. You can see 0015, I believe, is another one. DNS domain name. So I could say, okay, it's demo. Here's your DNS domain name, and it's demo.itpro.tv. All right, and that becomes your DNS suffix. All right, and I'll go ahead and I think that's all. There's other ones out there that you can do, but those are three of the ones that I would really I would know. All right. Now let me check out the properties of that. I don't think I added it. Okay, so let me do this one more time, and I'm glad I showed you. I resolved the name, and I got so happy that the name resolved that I forgot to even add it. So again press apply. dco1.demo. Right, .itpro.tv. And again, all I'm going to say is, hey, DNS, and you are not going to, I have no clue what that is, but that is not going to resolve. You got to spell the name right, Wes. So demo.itpro.tv, we could say resolve. Here's the IP address, and here's the important part. You got to choose add. All right, and what it's going to do is it's validating. It says, is our DNS server even running on that machine? And it checks, and it queries it. It says, hey, DNS, are you out there? I need to talk to you for a second because somebody's about to add you to the DHCP option. So I got to verify and validate that you even exist. And it did. So the communication little handshake happens. It says, yeah, it's okay. We're good. We're validated. And now we can choose okay. And that's why it's important. The value here when we got to the DNS server, you don't want to see that when it says none. It's not going to help name resolution if you don't have a DNS server to look to. All right, so now what happens with these scope options is this lets me know that, hey, we are going to have this router, this DNS server, and this is going to be our domain name. All right. Now we have other things. Remember they talked about, I mentioned a pool, right? Well, if I look at the pool, that's that range, right? Again, just intermixing terminology, synonymous, with each other, right? Is just remember the range, right? So it says address range for distribution, and I can see that right there, okay? Address leases. If a computer has a lease, I can see that. Well, let's go ahead and let's see, let's activate this scope, all right? So I've got some scope options. I've got a pool set up. Let me go ahead, right-click, and we'll choose activate. Notice that the little down arrow and that red arrow have disappeared, and we've got green lights all the way. Lets me know that this is now an active DHCP server. All right, we're going to switch back over our Windows client. Let's see what that looks like on the client side. All right. Now, my head's kind of covering this up, but if I go down to the little monitor icon with the little network cable in front of it, that'll bring, and right-click on it, choose Network and Sharing Center. It brings up the Network and Sharing Center, and I want to go to the adapter settings. Now from the adapter settings, I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to select the properties of the network adapter by selecting the network adapter, right-clicking on it, and choose status. And then choose details. All right. Now, notice that I don't have a default gateway. Well, why don't I have a default gateway? And I point this out because on the exam, they might give you an exhibit this way and say, why don't you have a default gateway? You've configured the DHCP server to hand out the router that you just seen us do. Well, I want you to pay attention to that line right there. DHCP enabled? No. That should be your telltale sign also in the context of another question that you could get is whether this is dynamic or a static address. It's static. I've manually set it because we aren't using DHCP, and those are the only two options, essentially, that we have here. We'll go ahead and choose close. We're going to go to the properties of the network adapter this time. And here we're going to choose Internet Protocol version 4. And then we'll go down here and we will choose properties, right? And then from properties, you can see use the following. Anytime I say use the following, that definitely means I have configured this, right? And this is one of the reasons we don't have a default gateway. Wes fat fingered the keyboard or took a holiday and didn't decide to actually put a default gateway in there. But if I change to obtain an IP address automatically, now I'm going to be using DHCP, right? And I'm also going to go ahead and say, you know what? Since it's a host configuration protocol, why don't you just go ahead and obtain the DHCP server address automatically as well? And we'll go ahead and choose OK. Now, when I choose OK here, it takes a second sometimes. If you're in a lab environment, like Practice Labs has their lab environment, if you're following along, sometimes you'll see it lock up, and if you get Jiminy Cricket's click happy, you'll see not responding. Just give it a second. Because like we've talked about in our other episodes, as part of the DHCP IP address process, lease process, it's going to go through the DORA process, that discover, offer, request, acknowledge. The moment I hit OK, or OK and then close, excuse me, there's two levels here, close. All right, and you might notice just for a second that I got that little spinning wheel there and it said identifying, right? So it was going through that process saying, hey, anybody out there got an IP address that I can have, all right? Now notice that it says, and this is unauthenticated, my computer, we'll worry about the domain part of it here in a second. I'm not exactly sure why it's unauthenticated, but we'll switch back over here real quick. And notice that, oh, Zach, I still don't see a lease. Well, maybe it didn't work. No, unfortunately, the DHCP console, like the DNS console, sometimes, well, just about all the time, it needs refreshed. It's not dynamic. As much as the DHCP service is dynamic, unfortunately, this console is not. So we'll go ahead and we'll right-click on it. We'll choose refresh. Look at that. We've got a lease available.
Yay.
Right? And that's what I want to see. If I right-click on this, actually, I'm not going to, there's nothing really that we have to do here other than see that I've got an expiration time, right? It lets me know that if this computer, and actually, you know, when I say if this computer doesn't call in by the expiration time, it's going to release this IP address. Let's clarify that a little bit more. Actually, 50% of the lease goes by halfway through that 8-day cycle that you've seen us configure this. Our computer is going to say, hey, I'm still out here. DHCP server, I'm still out here. I'm still using this IP address. And if the admin hasn't configured anything different, what's going to happen is the DHCP server is going to say, oh, okay, no problem. Let's just renew the lease. It's like calling in the rental car company and say, I was only supposed to be in town a week, but unfortunately, we're going to be here another week. Can I extend the lease that I have on the rental car? And if they don't need to use the car, they say, sure, no problem. Well, you're going to pay the money, but we'll go ahead and extend the time that you have the car, right? No different. Now, if we want to see that lease, we can actually jump over to our Windows 10 machine here. And if we look at our Windows 10 machine, if I right-click on my Windows icon and I choose PowerShell, let me give us a little bit more real estate here and clear the screen out. I can do an ipconfig /all, and let's see if we've got some of that information that we've configured on the DHCP side, right? I know that I can see the IP address that was handed. Notice it's the first one in the pool, right after the router there, all right? Notice that it tells me when the lease was obtained, right? I have that information right here. We've seen when it expires, right? That's the information that correlates with what we just seen over there in the properties of lease on the DHCP side, server side, right? Remember what we configured our default gateway? 1.1? Well, there it is. Remember our DHCP server is who we're talking to now. Notice our DNS server. We said, I want you to use this DNS server. And we put in the IP address. We resolved it, verified it, communicated, validated that we were talking. Well, guess what? It's right there. Remember when we said domain name, you're going to use this domain name? I want you to look at the connection-specific DNS service or suffix. I want you to look at the DNS search list. Look, there's our domain name. We've applied it to this machine in the IP properties of the network adapter. The operating system already knows that it's a domain computer. We've seen that earlier when we were talking about fully qualified domain names. But now, according to the IP properties of the network adapter, it's going to apply that domain name to itself, right? So we can see that right here. Now, the other thing that we want to talk about real quick is I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to switch back over to our server here. Remember that I told you that we can also, that we could set up exclusions, right? An exclusion is nothing more, if you will, than saying exclude this from that pool, right? So if I say, if I right-click, right, on the address pool, remember I told you, you can always come back to this and do that, right? I could set that range here after the fact, right? That's no different. All right, I could set that exclusion range. But what if I want to manage the IP address of a device dynamically, but at the same time, I want to make sure that it has the same IP address every time it calls out to the network. Well, that's where something known as a reservation comes in handy. All right. Let's say, and just hypothetically, all right, I've got a web server. I don't want its IP address to change. Don't want it to change. Now, I could statically set it up, and that would be good too. But I can also control almost like a static nature in the fact that I could say, I could come in here, right? And if I do this, I tell you what, we'll set up, I'm gonna work a little crazy here, right?
Okay.
In fact, let me go ahead and let me configure the network properties of the network adapter one more time. And what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna set this back. I'm gonna set this back to a static IP address. We're gonna take DHCP out of the list here. So I'm going to show you something kind of cool. We'll do 192.168, and I'll tell you what, I'll put that right back to where it was, .1.10. We use the same subnet mask, and I will manually set the DNS server. All right, so we're back. All right, if I choose right-click and choose status, details, you should see, ladies and gentlemen, that we are right back where we started off, right? No DHCP. Now, I want that computer, let's say that computer is my web server. I always want it to have the same IP address. But I want to go ahead and just kind of manage the other options through DHCP. So this is where the exclusion comes in handy. All right, so what I can do is I can right-click and I can choose New Reservation. Now, I want you to understand that in your objectives, it says MAC reservation. Sometimes you just see reservation. And that's the reason being is because DHCP calls out with a broadcast communication. So there's a MAC address that's also associated. And we can say, when you get that broadcast communication and it's a computer with this MAC address, you will apply this IP address to it every time it asks for an IP address. So that's what I need. It's one of the criteria that I need for a MAC reservation, if you will. I have to come over here and I've got to get that MAC address. There's an easy way to do this. I could just copy it right there, or I could open up, let's say, PowerShell, and I could do a get MAC. Now, if you got more than one MAC address, like I happen to have here, it might get a little confusing as to which one's which. Thank goodness for me, the other one is disconnected, so I know chances are, process of elimination. Here's my detective skills, right? That's why I don't make a good detective. It's disconnected, so chances are that one's not going to work, right? And now that I've got that copied, I'll call this, maybe I'll call this web server for whatever reason, just so I can identify it, right? And I want it to have, let's say, I don't know, 250, all right? And I'll put in its MAC address, right? And what I'm going to do is I'm going to choose add and then choose close. Now, if it calls out with a broadcast trying to look at that MAC address, it'll fail if it doesn't find it, all right? In this case, it did find it, all right? And I can go in, and if I expand out, I now have a reservation, all right? And I can look at the properties of the reservation. And I can also go a little bit farther, right? If I want, you know, because we have those TTLs that we were talking about in the DNS, time to live, and it's gonna basically throw out a record after a while. Well, I can actually do a dynamic update, and this is really cool. When DHCP says, you get this IP address, I'll go ahead and communicate with DNS for you, update the DNS record. So again, we don't have to worry about those stale records according to the TTLs getting in the way. It'll update it automatically and say, you just got a new IP address, let me go ahead and update the DNS database so we're both in agreement that we have the current information. That's a great thing to have too. All right, so I'm gonna go ahead and I'm just gonna leave all of that at the default. I'll choose OK. And now what we're gonna do, all right, I'm gonna come back here and I want you to see something here. Notice that we still have an IP address for client 02, the one that just did called out to the network. So what happened? Why has it still got this IP address? It's a lease. According to the DHCP server, it's not going to talk to this computer. So according to the DHCP server, it's still using that IP address. And notice the reservation is inactive. Well, I know as the administrator that I just cleared that IP address, so I can also right-click and I can choose delete to the obtained IP address, and it's gone. And now what we have to do is we'll switch back over to our other computer. We'll bring back up the properties of the network adapter. Let me go ahead and close this down, choose properties here. And we'll go to Internet Protocol version 4, properties, and yes, we are going to switch that back over to obtain an IP address automatically and a DNS server automatically. We'll choose OK. We'll choose close. Should see a little spinning Cheerio here just for a second. I don't know, did you catch that? That's the DORA process. Got to look quick. Sometimes it takes a bit. Other times it's really fast. All right, and if I do an IP config space /all. All right. Oh, and you know what? It's got an PIP address. Let's find out why that is. Sometimes when you get, and apparently it's active. Notice this here, 192.168.1.250. All right, so I have an active reservation that this computer is now utilizing. Let me see, I might have just jumped the gun on that too fast. Let's try that one more time. Oh, and it did finally, it did. I was a little bit faster than the refresh, and that doesn't usually happen. Usually I'm 2 steps behind. But now you notice here, right? 192.168.1.250, there's the reservation, all right? And that means every time this computer, if it looks at it, it's got a lease that's expired, and it calls back out to the network and says, DHCP, I need an IP address. It's going to get that same one every time. That's what's known as a MAC reservation, or a reservation, if you will. Now, I've mentioned a couple of concepts. Last thing, I know I'm running way late on this one. Zach's let me know. We got to wrap this one up, but there are just a couple more things that I want to put into this episode, especially because 2 of them relate to DHCP. One of them also relates to DNS, and that is something known as a DHCP relay agent or an IP helper. Now, IP helpers, essentially, what you got to understand that broadcast communications, routers do not allow broadcast communications to traverse their interfaces, right? So if a router receives a broadcast communication on one network adapter, it's not going to pass that over to the next network, right? It filters that and throws it away. But sometimes you'll have a DHCP server that's on one network, and you'll have a client that's on a completely different subnet, and you want it to be able to communicate with the DHCP server by broadcasting, right? The DORA process, discovery. But how do I do that? If the discovery packet's a broadcast, how do I get that across the router's interface when it's being picky and it's discarding broadcast? Well, that's where the DHCP relay agent comes in. The router will see this UDP broadcast DHCP request, and it'll wrap it a unicast transmission. It'll convert it into a unicast transmission, and it'll send it directly to the other network, directly to the DHCP server. That will pass a router's interface, because then after that process, it's a unicast address. And now the communication with the DHCP relay agent, it can relay that information in between. All right? Now, doesn't necessarily mean that it has to be a router. You can have, where the client is, you can configure it to use the DHCP relay agent. The DHCP relay agent can wrap it in a unicast, send it directly to the router, and the router passes unicast anyway. So to the router, it'd be transparent at that point. IP helper, that just means when you have some kind of UDP broadcast service request like that, the router's going to drop it because it's a broadcast communication. So what does an IP helper do? It just takes that broadcast communication, wraps it into a unicast, and directs it over to where the service is. And they're kind of using these together because that's exactly what a DHCP DHCP relay agent does. It takes that broadcast communication, wraps it into a unicast, and sends it directly to the DHCP server so that it can finish the DORA process. Now, I showed you one example of where DNS and DHCP can kind of communicate together, and they can make each other aware, right, through dynamic registration. That's okay. What if you have 5,000 computers across all these different subnets, different DNS servers, and you want to be able to allow the coordination between DHCP and DNS? Well, that's where the Internet Protocol Address Management technology comes in, IPAM as they call it. It allows you to coordinate on a large scale too, up to a very large scale, the communication between DHCP and DNS, so that we agree. Last but not least is network time protocol. I'm not going to go into that one too much because Zach, you and I talked about that in the protocol episodes. Remember, synchronization is important, time is important, especially on a Windows domain. So the NTP is a service that, hey, I need time synchronization. What do? I send a request to update my time clock. In a Windows domain, it just happens to be the master time clock, what's known as the PDC emulator. The domain control, one of the domain controllers, depending on how you've got it set up. I need to synchronize my time clock. Well, I'm going to use NTP to do that. So these are some very, very important network services and how they function. no DNS, no DHCP. Be aware of it for the exam because they're going to put you potentially into multiple scenarios, and you might know A plus B equals C, but what if I take out B? Do you know how we got C? So you're going to have to know all the pieces so that you can know what the answer is the next time they ask you on the Net Plus exam.
Unfortunately, Wes, you do provide us with all the pieces. This is Network Service Functions Part 3. Make sure you see Parts 1 and 2, and make sure you see everything in the CompTIA Net Plus series. While you're at it, check out the other videos in the course library. Hundreds of them, all designed to take you further. And tell everybody you know about IT Pro TV. They'll be very glad you did. Thanks for watching. I'm Zach Memis.
And I'm Wes Bryan.
And we will see you soon.
Thank you for watching IT Pro TV.